Hey family, we've been in this series for 6 weeks called Delivered. And I believe that God has delivered you from some things in your life. I believe some of you have seen deliverance from big things. And I believe some of you have seen deliverance in small, daily ways from God. Because I believe if you look back on 6 weeks when we started this series to now, you're in a different spot with the Lord. You're in a different spot than you were 6 weeks ago. And that's just this daily deliverance that God brings. And so I want you to think about where we've been. And I believe some of you have already forgotten. Even as I'm saying 6 weeks ago, you're like, 6 weeks, what? What was happening 6 weeks ago? Some of you at the gathering in your group time, you heard a word that you were like, that was for me. And you've already forgotten it. You've already forgotten it. There was a Harvard study that came out that said that memory in humans, we have this tendency to forget facts or events over time. I think we would all agree with that, right? But what they found is that the memory has this tendency to use it or lose it. It's that these memories, if they're called upon regularly, we remember them. And when we don't call upon these memories regularly, we forget them. So in case you forgot or just weren't here at the gathering, let me tell you some about where we've been these last 6 weeks. We've been talking about the Israelites, the people of God in the Old Testament and the book of Exodus. And we saw how Moses, when God called him, he asked this question, who am I? We talked about how God freed them from the Egyptians through these 10 plagues, and they were released from Egypt. We talked about how God doesn't waste suffering, he uses it, and how God sends us forward, not backward. And tonight, I want us to not forget. I want us to remember. To remember what God has done through the Israelites and in their lives. Remember what God has done for you. And even hear some testimony tonight about what God has done for me. We need to remember. One of my favorite quotes right now is, the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. What he did for another, he will do it again. What does that mean? It means that Jesus, in all his power and all his miracle working wonder, that what Jesus did once, he can still do it again today. He can do it for you. He can do it for me. That is who Jesus is. And so what he did for another, he can do it again. You know, there's power in sharing our testimony with other people. There's power in walking along life and looking to our left, looking to our right, who's next to us, and then telling the person next to us what God is doing in our midst. That is what it looks like to just share your testimony, to share what God is doing. There's power there. Because when you're in a season of thinking, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? God, do you see me? God, are you going to come through for me? When you're in that place, but you're walking along with someone else who is opening their mouth to tell you what God is doing in their life, then you can think, okay, God, you might not be doing it for me yet, but you're doing it for that person. And so I'm going to choose to remember what you're doing in their life, and I'm going to remember it for me. And so tonight, as we talk about the Israelites, as we talk about you, as we talk about me, I want you to have that mindset. I'm going to remember. Would you just tell that to yourself as you're listening? I'm going to remember. Most of you have heard me talk about my story and how I've seen the miracle working power of God. I've watched God bring breakthrough in relationships. I've watched him break addiction in people that I love. I've seen God do the impossible. And tonight I want to tell you a brief story of something more recent that God has done that I think is going to hit with you. So my husband, Duncan, was working in Dallas when we moved to the Fort Worth side of town. So I'm working on this side of town. He has this long commute. It's an hour and 30 minutes one way. He's working all day at this job he's not loving, and it's an hour and 30 minutes on the way home. And so this goes on for months at a time. Just the day in, day out grind of, I don't want to do this. I don't want to sit in my car for an hour and 30 minutes. I don't want to do this job. I don't want to sit in my car again for an hour and 30 minutes. How many of you have been there in your own way? You're just doing the day in, day out grind, and it's getting old. You're getting tired of it. That was where Duncan was at. And it was starting to impact us and change us at home even, because he'd come home frustrated with just his day in, day out life. Well, one day he went to work, and on the way to work, he decided, I'm going to worship and pray and press into the presence of God on the way to work for this hour and 30 minute commute. He got to work. He did the grind. That was his job. He got back in his car, came home. Same thing on the way home. He walked in the door and I said, how was your day? Because I noticed something was different about him. Come on, there is something that happens when we get in the presence of God that changes things. I noticed it when he walked in the door. And he said, nothing really. My day was fine. And I said, no. Tell me about your day. And he thought I was talking about work. And then he realized, oh yeah, on the way to work, I just spent time with God. And on the way home, I just spent time with God. I started venting. I started telling him how things were hard. It wasn't this glamorous prayer time. It was just being real in front of the Lord. Some of you need that reminder that things happen when we're just real in front of the Lord. And so he did that. And I wish I could tell you that the very next day at work was incredible, that things changed for him. It didn't. He just kept pressing in on the drive there, doing his job, pressing in on the way home. Months later, COVID hits. So he's working from home. He doesn't have this commute anymore. And we're excited. We're thinking it was the commute that was so rough. Here we go. Well, the job still was just the job. It was just the grind. And we were praying, God, what is Duncan supposed to do? Is he supposed to keep this job? Is he supposed to move on to something different? What are we doing? And God said clearly to us, I want you to wait on me and just be still. And we both heard that. And so we said, okay, God. And let me just tell you, that's easier said than done. But we held one another to it. We were just patient, waiting on the Lord. And in May of 2020, COVID is happening, right? We're just waiting on the Lord. May of 2020, a recruiter approaches him out of nowhere. And I say out of nowhere because in the natural, it seemed out of nowhere. We hadn't put his resume out. We hadn't gone looking for a job. But in the spiritual, Duncan had been pressing in. Duncan had been asking God for something different. And so this recruiter approaches him. Duncan starts the journey. He gets the job. Everything pans out in a way that we were praying into and believing God for. And so in July, he started this new job. And y'all, we got to remember, come on, we got to remember what God has done so that the next time something hard comes or the next time we're in a season of just the grind, the day in, day out, we can stop and say, no, remember what God did when you did that last time? Remember how God came through? Remember how he made a way where we saw no way? We have to remember. We got to remember. And so what are those stories for you in your life? The big, the little, the day in, day out stories that God is calling you to remember. Tonight, I want us to dive in to this story from the book of Exodus, the last time we're opening this for this series, and I'm so excited. So turn to Exodus chapter 14. Open your Bibles. We're going to camp out in Exodus 14 for a while. So while you're turning there, I just want to remind you, God has freed them from Egypt with these 10 plagues. Remember that. They've seen him do miracles and deliver them. They have a testimony at this point about what God has done for them. And then here they go. They're headed out into the wilderness, following God. And as they head out, the Egyptians decide to pursue them, to chase after them, to kill them. As we read through chapter 14, I want to talk to four mindsets that I believe each of us have either experienced or are currently experiencing. You could see yourself in one of these four. And I believe that remembering what God has done previously, remembering what God has done in your life, remembering what God has done in the life of someone else around you through a testimony, remembering what God has done in the lives of the Israelites in the book of Exodus, remembering what God has done can shift the mindset. It can shift your mindset. So we're going to start reading Exodus 14. Starting in verse 10, look there with me. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord and said to Moses, why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt? Didn't we tell you that this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see them again because the Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. And so the first one in the room I want to speak to is the worried one. The one who is worried about tomorrow. The one who is worried about what's going to come. The one who's worried about relationships in your life. The one who's worried about who you're going to sit with at lunch. Who's going to be your friend in that moment. The one who's worried about what God is going to do in your future. The one who reads this story and thinks, yeah, I would have rather have stayed in Egypt because you worry about the future. I'm talking to the worried one. God says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And when you look back on your life, when you remember what God has done before for you, for someone else, for the Israelites, you can receive that. Do not be afraid. And so we go from a mindset of being worried to a mindset of being expectant. God, what are you going to do? God, how are you going to move? I'm expectant. And so I want you to write worried/expectant. And I want you to just cross out the word worried. Cross out the word worried, leave expectant there, write it next to verse 13. Next to verse 13. After you write that, keep reading with me. We're going to pick up in verse 15. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground.'" Come on, that will preach alone. That'll preach alone. And it keeps going. Verse 17, it says, "And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will charge in after the Israelites. My glory will be displayed through Pharaoh and his troops, his chariots and his charioteers. When my glory is displayed through them, all Egypt will see my glory and know that I am the Lord." Verse 19, "Then the angel of God who had been leading the people of Israel moved to the rear of the camp. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them. The cloud settled between the Egyptian and Israelite camps. As darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and the Israelites didn't approach each other all night." Look back at verse 19. It says, "Then the angel of God who had been leading the people of Israel moved to the rear of the camp." I'm speaking to the insecure one now. The one who's constantly looking over your shoulder, checking yourself, so self-conscious, never wanting to walk into a room alone, always afraid if you're going to have people with you or be alone. You're insecure about your future. You're insecure about who you are. You question your personality. You're not confident in who God made you to be. You're insecure. Could you hear from this that God has your back? God has your back. And when you look back on your life and you consider your testimony, you remember what God has done, you remember what God has done for someone else, you remember what God has done here for the Israelites, you stand up a little taller because your God has your back. And so you go from this mindset of being insecure to a mindset of being confident, because God has your back. And so I want you to write that next to verse 19, insecure, write out insecure, but then cross it out and write confident next to verse 19. Confident because God has your back. We're going to keep reading. Verse 21, just pick up once you finish writing. It says, "Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turning the seabed into dry land." Thank you, God. "So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side." Verse 23, "Then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and charioteers, chased them into the middle of the sea. But just before dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites," the Egyptians shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." The Lord is fighting for them. I want to speak to the stuck one, the one who is just stuck where you're at. You look in front of you and you see a wall. You look in front of you and you just see the mess. You see the chaos. You see no way out. You're just stuck in your relationship with God. You're stuck in that relationship with a significant other. You're stuck where you're at. Where you see a wall, God sees a way. Where you see a wall, God sees a way. These people, God told them that he was going to split the water. They kept walking. Look back at verse 22. It says, "So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground." They walked through. And so where you feel stuck, would you just keep moving? Would you just keep moving, going where God is calling you, saying, "God, I trust you. It doesn't make sense and I don't get it, but I'm going to keep moving," because as you keep moving, you know that God is making a way. Where you see a wall, God sees a way. And so I want you to write next to verse 22, stuck, cross it out, and I want you to write moving. moving, because you're going to keep moving. Okay, write that. Pick up with me. Verse 26, it says, when all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers. So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground as the water stood up like a wall on both sides. Can you picture it? Can you just picture that? This sea split, dry ground, completely dry ground. They cross and God completely destroys the enemy that's coming after them. Verse 30, that is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore. When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And so to the doubting one, to the one in the room who doubts that God can still do these things today, to the one who doubts, you think God could still do these things, but you doubt that he would do it for you. He loves you. He is pursuing you. He is coming after you. This God of the Israelites, my God that I've seen in my life, he is your God as well. He is still alive and well today. And so in your doubt, could you turn from a mindset of doubt to a mindset of trust? Like these Israelites who put their trust in the Lord again. They just said, God, you are who you say you are. I put my trust in you again. Would you go from doubt to trust that God is who he says he is? He is who he says he is. So next to verse 31, I want you to write doubt, cross it out, and I want you to write trust. I want you to write trust. Trust. Some of you just need to remember again what God has done for you. Some of you need to remember again, call to mind again what God has done in the life of someone else alongside you. Some of you need to remember again what God has done in Exodus 14, that he is still the same God today. Some of you just need to remember. And testimony is a huge part of that. Sharing your testimony with the people alongside you. Testimony is so important. Why? Because it reminds us who God is. He doesn't need to be reminded who he is. We need to remind ourselves who he is. Testimony is important because it gives credit where credit is due. That God is worthy of it all, that he is still this God today. It gives credit where credit is due. And testimony is important because it calls us to remember. It calls us to remember. I believe we are people who are going to have testimony after testimony about what God has done in our life and the deliverance that he has brought. Remember the Harvard study at the beginning that I mentioned. If we don't use these memories, we're just going to lose them. And so the story of the Israelites in Exodus 14, it was a good testimony then. It is still a good testimony now in 2021. What is the testimony God is giving you? What is it? Because we got to use it or you're just going to lose it.
What's up, fam? Thank you so much for joining us again for an amazing message. Us in the room, we were blessed by it, and we pray that you felt and encountered God from wherever you were watching from. In the description below, we have some questions and some scriptures that we want you to dig into as a follow-up to this lesson. Y'all, we are all on the journey of being delivered. So no matter where you are, if you are further along or just getting started, this series is for all of us. And so go ahead and dig in to the content that's in the description. Maybe call a friend and engage with a friend. Make sure that you follow us on Instagram. Make sure that if you have any questions, you write it down in the comments below. We love you so much, and we'll see you next week. Peace.